The screech of metal on metal pierced the Bengal night as the Maurya Express shuddered to an unscheduled halt deep in the jungle darkness. What happened next defied every principle of modern warfare. A single retired soldier, armed only with an ancient curved blade, would take on 40 armed bandits in the cramped corridors of a moving train and emerge victorious. The mathematical impossibility of it should have been laughable, except that by dawn on September 3rd, 2010, 3 robbers lay dead, 8 more bled from khukuri wounds, and the remaining 29 had fled into the forest like scattered prey, abandoning their loot in terror of one man who refused to watch evil unfold in silence. This is the story of Bishnu Shrestha, a 35-year-old Gurkha warrior who was supposed to be heading home to peaceful retirement when fate handed him the most lopsided battle in military history. In 20 minutes of brutal hand-to-hand combat, he would prove that some men are forged from different steel, that when honor calls, mathematics becomes irrelevant, and one blade wielded with righteous fury can cleave through an army of cowards. What you're about to read is not a legend embellished by time, but documented fact that reads like the stuff of ancient epics, reminding us that in our age of drone warfare and cyber battles, sometimes the oldest weapons, courage, steel, and an unbreakable code of honor remain the most devastating of all, stating, Baksha, Durali Kola, Parbat District, Nepal, 1975. In the high country of Nepal's Parbat district, where oxygen grows thin and only the hardy survive, children learn to walk on slopes that would terrify mountain climbers. Here, in the village of Baksha Durali Kola, a name that translates roughly to the stream where heroes are born. Bishnu Shrestha drew his first breath in 1975, inheriting a legacy written in blood and steel across centuries of warfare. The mountains had been calling to the Gurung people for generations, and they had answered with their sons. In this remote corner of Ward Number 9, where 80% of residents belonged to the legendary warrior caste that would dominate British and Indian Gurkha regiments, being born meant being born to fight. The village elders still spoke in hushed tones of ancestors who had faced down British East India Company forces with nothing but curved blades and unshakable resolve, warriors so fierce that their enemies eventually begged them to fight alongside them instead of against them. Young Bishnu's father, Gopal Babu Shrestha, carried the scars and stories of Vietnam across his weathered hands, a veteran of the same 7-8 platoon that his son would one day join. In the evenings, as mist rolled down from the peaks and yak bells echoed across the valleys, Gopal would clean and oil his service khukuri while recounting tales of jungle warfare half a world away. The blade, with its distinctive forward curve and razor edge, was more than a weapon. It was the physical manifestation of Gurkha honor, a tool that had carved the regiment's reputation from the mountains of Afghanistan to the rice paddies of Southeast Asia. The boy absorbed these lessons like granite absorbs rain, slowly, deeply, permanently. In a culture where the motto, "It is better to die than be a coward," wasn't just a saying but a lived philosophy, Bishnu learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. He watched his father's hands, scarred from combat, but gentle enough to mend a bird's broken wing. He learned that true warriors fought not because they loved violence, but because they loved something more than their own safety. When the recruiting officers came through Parbat district in the early 1990s, searching for young men with the rare combination of physical strength and moral backbone required for Gurkha service, they found in Bishnu Shrestha exactly what they were looking for: a son of the mountains who understood that some things were worth dying for. As his family prepared to relocate to Pokhara following his selection for an Indian Gurkha regiment, the young man carried with him not just the blessing of his ancestors, but their uncompromising code, a code that would be tested decades later in the most unlikely of battlefields. A passenger train racing through the darkness toward an appointment with destiny. The transformation from mountain boy to Gurkha warrior begins with a ritual older than nations. The first time a recruit's fingers close around the leather-wrapped handle of his regimental khukuri. For Bishnu Shrestha, standing at attention in the barracks of the 7th Battalion of the 8th Gorkha Rifles, that moment came with the weight of centuries pressing down on his shoulders, not just his father's legacy, but the ghosts of every warrior who had carried that curved blade before him. The 8th Gorkha Rifles traced their lineage to 1824, when British officers first witnessed Nepalese soldiers charge uphill into cannon fire, with nothing but steel and determination. By the time young Bishnu joined their ranks, the regiment had earned battle honors from Burma to Gallipoli, from the northwest frontier to the jungles of World War II. Their roll call read like a catalogue of impossible victories. Lakhiman Gurung, who held off 200 Japanese soldiers single-handedly despite losing his right hand to a grenade. Agansing Rai, who charged machine gun nests with such ferocity that surviving enemies spoke his name in whispers for decades afterward. The training was designed to break men before rebuilding them into something harder. In the scorching heat of Indian summer and the bone-deep cold of high-altitude exercises, Bishnu learned that the khukuri wasn't just about the blade. It was about becoming the blade. Hours of drill turned muscle memory into instinct, transforming the ancient weapon from tool to extension of will. The distinctive forward curve that gave the khukuri its devastating chopping power became as familiar as his own heartbeat. The balance point as natural as breathing. But technique was only half the equation. The regiment's motto, "It is better to die than be a coward," wasn't carved into stone monuments. It was carved into souls. Through years of service, Bishnu absorbed the unwritten code that would define every decision he would ever make. That a Gurkha's duty extended beyond orders, beyond nationality, beyond self-preservation. When civilians were threatened, when the innocent faced evil, when justice hung in the balance, a Gurkha didn't calculate odds. He acted. As the years passed and Bishnu earned his stripes, rising steadily to the rank of Naik, corporal, he carried forward not just his father's example, but the accumulated honor of every warrior who had worn the crossed khukuri's insignia. The regiment had taught him that courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being afraid and doing what was right anyway. They had shown him that true strength lay not in the steel of his blade, but in the steel of his character. Most importantly, they had prepared him for a moment he couldn't yet imagine. A night when everything he had learned about duty, honor, and the sacred responsibility to protect the defenseless would be tested in 20 minutes of brutal combat against impossible odds. The boy from the mountains had become something rarer than a skilled soldier. He had become a guardian, forged in the ancient tradition of warriors who understood that some battles choose you. And when they do, there is only one acceptable response: to draw steel and stand firm against the darkness. The first time Naik Bishnu Shrestha faced death in combat, it came not with the dramatic flourish of Hollywood war films, but with the mundane brutality of a roadside bomb detonating 30 meters from his patrol. In the dust and confusion that followed, ears ringing, vision blurred, the metallic taste of blood and cordite thick in his throat, he discovered what his instructors had tried to teach him but could never fully convey: that real warfare strips away everything except what matters most. Across multiple tours of duty that would take him from the scorching deserts of Iraq to the treacherous mountain passes of Afghanistan, Bishnu learned to navigate the razor's edge between life and death, with the calm precision of a surgeon. Each deployment added layers to his understanding of combat, not just the technical aspects of weapons and tactics, but the psychological landscape of men under extreme stress. He watched brave soldiers crumble when pushed beyond their limits and witnessed quiet clerks transform into lions when their comrades were threatened. In the bazaars of Kabul, where every smile might hide a suicide vest and every friendly wave could precede an ambush, Bishnu developed the sixth sense that separates survivors from casualties. His khukuri rode on his hip through firefights where bullets whined overhead like angry wasps, through night raids where shadows moved with lethal intent, through moments when split-second decisions meant the difference between returning home and returning in a flag-draped box. The ancient blade never left its sheath during these operations. Modern warfare demanded modern weapons, but its presence served as a constant reminder of who he was and what he represented. The irregular warfare of Iraq and Afghanistan taught him lessons no peacetime training could provide. He learned that courage wasn't a finite resource that could be depleted, but a muscle that grew stronger with use. He discovered that the most dangerous enemies weren't always the ones shooting at you, but the ones who convinced you to lower your guard. Most crucially, he understood that heroism rarely announced itself with trumpets and fanfare. It usually arrived wearing civilian clothes in situations where doing nothing would be easier than doing what was right. Between deployments, during brief returns to base, Bishnu would clean and sharpen his khukuri with the methodical precision of a craftsman, maintaining his most precious tool. The ritual connected him to something larger than the immediate chaos of modern warfare, to the unbroken chain of warriors who had carried that same blade design into battle for centuries before aircraft and artillery existed. His fellow soldiers, initially skeptical of the medieval relic their Gurkha comrade insisted on carrying, gradually came to understand that the khukuri represented something more profound than mere nostalgia. By the time Bishnu reached his mid-30s, having survived multiple combat tours and earned the quiet respect of men who had learned to judge warriors by their actions rather than their words, he carried himself with the understated confidence of someone who had looked death in the eye repeatedly and never blinked first. The mountains of Nepal had given him strength. The regiment had given him purpose. But the crucible of actual combat had given him something rarer and more valuable: the absolute certainty that when the moment came to choose between personal safety and moral duty, there would be no hesitation. As his military service drew to a close in 2010, Naik Bishnu Shrestha looked forward to laying down his weapons and returning to the peaceful mountains of his youth. He had served with honor, fought with distinction, and earned his rest. What he couldn't know, as he prepared for retirement, was that his most legendary battle still lay ahead. Not in some distant theater of war, but on a passenger train racing through the jungles of West Bengal, where every lesson he had learned about courage, duty, and the sacred responsibility to protect the innocent would be tested in the most unlikely of circumstances. September 2010, the Maurya Express. The irony wasn't lost on Bishnu Shrestha as he settled into his seat aboard the Maurya Express that humid September evening. Here he was, riding a train named after Chandragupta Maurya, the ancient emperor who had united the Indian subcontinent through a combination of military genius and ruthless determination, while finally heading home to hang up his own weapons for good. At 35, the newly retired Naik had earned his peace, trading the adrenaline-soaked battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan for the prospect of quiet mountain mornings and the simple rhythms of civilian life. The train itself was a microcosm of modern India. Packed carriages filled with families returning from visits to relatives, businessmen clutching laptops and cell phones, students heading back to universities, and elderly couples making pilgrimages to distant temples. The Maurya Express ran the vital route from Ranchi to Gorakhpur, carrying its human cargo through some of the most remote and beautiful and dangerous territory in West Bengal. Outside the windows, dense jungle pressed close to the tracks. a green wall of vegetation that had swallowed countless secrets over the centuries. As the train picked up speed and settled into its hypnotic rhythm, Bishnu found himself caught between two worlds: the warrior he had been and the peaceful man he hoped to become. His khukuri still rode at his side. Old habits died hard, and a Gurkha without his blade felt as naked as a bird without wings. But for the first time in years, he wasn't scanning for threats or calculating firing positions. Instead, he watched the countryside roll past and allowed himself to imagine a future without the constant weight of responsibility for other men's lives. The conversations around him painted a picture of ordinary people living ordinary lives. A teenage girl chatting excitedly with her parents about her upcoming college entrance exams. A middle-aged man showing off photos of his newborn grandson. An elderly woman sharing homemade sweets with fellow passengers. This was what he had fought to protect across multiple deployments. Not abstract concepts of freedom or democracy, but these simple human moments of connection and hope. The train's evening routine unfolded with the comfortable predictability of a ritual. Vendors walking the aisles selling tea and snacks, passengers settling in for the long overnight journey, children growing sleepy against their mothers' shoulders. As darkness gathered outside and the jungle sounds gave way to the steady clatter of wheels on rails, Bishnu felt himself relaxing in ways he hadn't experienced in years. For once, someone else was responsible for watching the horizon for danger. He couldn't have known as he gazed out at the peaceful night sky and contemplated his future among the mountains of Nepal. That destiny was already in motion. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, a group of armed men was putting the finishing touches on a plan that would transform this routine journey into something far more sinister. They had chosen their target well. The Maurya Express carried enough passengers to make the night profitable, and the remote jungle location offered multiple escape routes. What they hadn't factored into their calculations was the presence of a man who had spent the better part of 2 decades learning that evil only succeeds when good men choose to do nothing. As the train rolled deeper into the Bengal night, carrying its cargo of innocent dreams and quiet hopes, the stage was being set for an encounter that would prove, once again, that some men are forged from different steel, and that retirement papers are no match for a warrior's code when the moment of truth arrives. The first sign of trouble came not as a dramatic crash or explosion, but as something far more unsettling. The sudden, unscheduled shriek of brakes biting steel in the middle of nowhere. The Maurya Express lurched to a violent halt somewhere near Chittaranjan, West Bengal, throwing sleeping passengers against seatbacks and sending luggage tumbling from overhead compartments. In the confused seconds that followed, voices calling out an alarm, babies crying, the acrid smell of overheated brake pads drifting through open windows, most passengers assumed they had encountered a routine mechanical problem or track obstruction. Bishnu Shrestha knew better. Years of combat had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded violence, and everything about this stop felt wrong. The location was too isolated, the timing too convenient, and most tellingly, the sudden silence from the engine car suggested this wasn't a mechanical failure, but something far more deliberate. As he shifted slightly in his seat, his hand instinctively moved toward his hip where his khukuri rested, not drawing it, not yet, but simply confirming its presence with the unconscious reflex of a man who had learned that survival often came down to seconds. The attack, when it came, erupted with the coordinated precision of a military operation. Glass exploded inward as windows were smashed simultaneously along multiple cars. Dark figures poured through the breaches like water through a broken dam. 30 to 40 armed men, moving with the confidence of predators who had done this before. They carried an arsenal that would have impressed a small army, swords glinting in the dim carriage lights. curved daggers that caught and threw back reflections, pistols that may or may not have been functional but looked real enough to terrorize civilians. The transformation from peaceful passenger car to theater of horror took less than 30 seconds. Screams pierced the night as families were torn apart, elderly passengers thrown to the floor, children separated from their parents in the chaos. The bandits moved through the cars with systematic efficiency, barking orders in multiple dialects, their faces masked by cloth or shadow, their movements suggesting this was far from their first robbery. They knew exactly how to maximize terror while minimizing resistance, targeting the most vulnerable first, using the threat of violence against women and children to ensure compliance from the men. Jewelry, money, phones, everything out. The commands came in rapid-fire bursts as the robbers worked their way down the aisles, collecting valuables with the practiced ease of men who had reduced human misery to a business transaction. Rings were torn from fingers, necklaces ripped from throats, wallets and purses disappeared into bulging sacks. The passengers, faced with overwhelming force and the very real threat of death, had no choice but to comply, handing over life savings, family heirlooms, and precious memories transformed into mere objects by the barrel of a gun. Through it all, Naik Bishnu Shrestha sat motionless, his expression giving nothing away. To the casual observer, he appeared to be just another terrified passenger, frozen by the sudden violence erupting around him. But beneath that carefully controlled exterior, a different kind of calculation was taking place. His trained eyes catalogued the attackers' positions, their weapons, their apparent skill levels. His mind automatically began formulating tactical assessments, angles of attack, potential choke points, civilian positions that would complicate any response. Most importantly, he was waiting, not out of cowardice, but out of the hard-won wisdom that told him there was a difference between fighting and fighting smart. When the robbers reached him, demanding his valuables with the same casual brutality they had shown everyone else, Bishnu handed over his wallet without a word. This wasn't his fight, not yet. These were material possessions, replaceable objects that meant nothing compared to human life. He had learned long ago that true courage sometimes meant swallowing your pride and waiting for the moment when action would serve a purpose greater than mere defiance. As the bandits moved on to their next victims, satisfied with their easy conquest of the quiet passenger, they made a critical error that would soon prove fatal. They failed to notice that while they had taken his money, they had overlooked the one thing no Gurkha ever surrenders willingly: his blade. For 15 agonizing minutes, Bishnu Shrestha had watched evil work its methodical way through the passenger cars, forcing himself to remain motionless as families were terrorized and life savings stolen. Every fiber of his warrior's soul screamed for action, but his mind held firm to the tactical reality. Rushing into a chaotic melee with dozens of armed men while surrounded by innocent civilians would likely result in more deaths, not fewer. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple, until they weren't. The moment that would transform a routine robbery into legend began with the sound of tearing fabric. Near Shrestha's seat, a young woman, barely 18, traveling with her parents like thousands of college-bound students across India, had caught the attention of the robbery's ringleader. What happened next crossed a line that existed not in law or regulation, but in the deepest code that governs the difference between civilization and savagery. The bandit chief's knife sliced through her shirt with deliberate cruelty, exposing her to the leering grins of his accomplices while her parents watched in helpless horror. "Please!" The girl's voice cut through the chaos, high and desperate, her eyes finding Bishnu's across the narrow aisle. "You are a soldier. Please save a sister." Those 7 words shattered every tactical calculation, every careful assessment of odds and angles and acceptable losses. In that moment, Bishnu Shrestha ceased to be a retired serviceman trying to avoid unnecessary confrontation and became what he had always been at his core, a Gurkha warrior who understood that some things mattered more than personal survival. The girl's plea didn't just reach his ears. It reached a part of him that had been forged in the mountains of Nepal, tempered in the fires of combat, and bound by an oath that transcended military service. The transformation that followed was almost imperceptible to anyone not trained to recognize it. Shrestha's breathing changed from the shallow pants of stress to the deeper, controlled rhythm of a man preparing for action. His shoulders settled, his center of gravity shifted lower, and his eyes began moving with the predatory focus of someone who had just stopped being prey and started being hunter. The bandits, drunk on their own power and the intoxicating ease of their conquest, failed to notice that the quiet passenger they had dismissed was no longer the same man who had handed over his wallet. Around him, the robbery continued its grotesque theater. Other passengers sobbing as their possessions disappeared, children crying for parents they couldn't see through the press of bodies, elderly couples clinging to each other as decades of memories were reduced to entries in a criminal's ledger. But at the epicenter of this chaos, something far more dangerous was taking shape. The girl's desperate cry had awakened something that the bandits' weapons and numbers could not intimidate, something that their crude understanding of power could never comprehend. The bandit leader, emboldened by the lack of resistance and intoxicated by his control over the terrified passengers, began to press his advantage. His hands moved with increasing boldness, his companions closing in with the pack mentality of predators sensing weakness. The girl's parents, paralyzed by the very real threat that any resistance would result in their daughter's death, could only watch as the unthinkable unfolded before them. In train cars filled with dozens of adult men, not one had the courage or means to intervene, except for the quiet figure who had been waiting, with the infinite patience of a true warrior, for the moment when action would serve something greater than mere vengeance. As the bandits' intentions became unmistakably clear, as the girl's terror reached a crescendo that would haunt the nightmares of every passenger who survived to remember it, Bishnu Shrestha's hand moved with deceptive casualness toward his hip. The robbers had made many mistakes that night, but none more fatal than believing they had disarmed him completely. Hidden beneath his clothing, patient as a coiled serpent, lay 18 inches of curved steel that had been waiting centuries for exactly this moment, when honor would demand its due, and a warrior would answer that call with everything he had learned about courage, duty, and the sacred responsibility to stand between evil and innocence. The steel sang as it cleared leather, a sound that had echoed across battlefields from the Khyber Pass to the jungles of Burma, a whisper of death that had announced the arrival of Gurkha justice for over 2 centuries. In one fluid motion that compressed years of training into a single, perfect arc of violence, Bishnu Shrestha rose from his seat and drew his khukuri, the ancient blade catching the dim carriage light and throwing it back like captured lightning. The bandit leader never saw it coming. One moment he was savoring his power over a helpless girl, drunk on the intoxicating certainty of his control. The next, he found himself lifted bodily from his victim and locked in the iron embrace of a man who had learned to kill efficiently in a dozen different countries. Shrestha's left arm snaked around the criminal's throat in a perfect sleeper hold, using the would-be rapist as a human shield, while his right hand brought the khukuri around in a devastating slash that opened the nearest bandit from shoulder to sternum. Blood painted the carriage walls in arterial sprays as the first robber spun away, his sword clattering uselessly to the floor. The others, caught completely off guard by the sudden transformation of their docile victim into an avenging demon, hesitated for a fatal split second, long enough for Shrestha to complete his initial assault and position himself between the girl and her attackers. One bandit, unable to strike at his human shield, but desperate to maintain the initiative, slashed wildly at the girl's throat. The blade drew a thin line of blood across her neck before Shrestha's khukuri found its mark, dropping the attacker with a lightning-quick thrust that would have made his drill instructors proud. What followed defied every principle of modern combat theory. Surrounded by nearly 40 armed men in the cramped confines of a passenger car, outnumbered by odds that should have been mathematically insurmountable, Naik Bishnu Shrestha proceeded to demonstrate why the British Empire had once trembled at the sound of Gurkha war cries. With his human shield neutralized by a quick slice across the throat, he launched himself into the midst of the bandits like a force of nature given human form. The khukuri became an extension of his will, its curved blade perfectly designed for the close-quarters butchery that followed. In the narrow aisles between seats, where the bandits' superior numbers became a liability rather than an advantage, Shrestha moved with the deadly grace of a predator in his element. Duck and slash. Another bandit fell clutching a severed artery. Parry and thrust, a criminal's scream cut short by 18 inches of steel finding its way between ribs. The ancient weapon, dismissed by modern military strategists as a romantic anachronism, proved devastatingly effective against men who had never faced an opponent willing to die before yielding. The fight raged through the passenger car with a savagery that seemed to bend the laws of physics. Shrestha took wounds that should have slowed him. A sword stroke that opened his left hand to the bone, severing every major artery and vein, painting the floor slick with his own blood. But the pain only seemed to fuel his fury, transforming him into something beyond human limitations. Even as crimson spurted from his mangled hand with each heartbeat, his right arm continued its deadly work, the khukuri rising and falling with mechanical precision. The psychological effect proved as devastating as the physical carnage. These bandits had built their careers on terrorizing the helpless, their confidence rooted in the certainty that superior numbers and weapons guaranteed victory. But they had never encountered anything like the whirlwind of controlled violence that Bishnu Shrestha unleashed upon them. Faced with a man who seemed immune to pain, who fought with the calm efficiency of someone performing a familiar task, their nerve began to crack. The sight of their companions falling like wheat before a scythe, the realization that their victim had become their executioner, sent ripples of terror through their ranks. For 20 minutes that felt like 20 hours, the battle raged through the carriages. Shrestha pursued the fleeing bandits from car to car, his blood-soaked form appearing like a specter of vengeance in doorways where criminals thought they had found safety. The mathematics of the engagement had become irrelevant. This was no longer about odds or tactics, but about the collision between evil and an immovable force of righteous fury. By the time the last bandit leaped from the train into the jungle darkness, preferring the uncertain mercy of wild animals to the certain justice of a Gurkha's blade, 3 of their number lay dead, and 8 more bled from wounds that would mark them for life. As the immediate danger passed and the adrenaline began to ebb, Bishnu Shrestha finally allowed himself to acknowledge the price of victory. His left hand hung useless at his side, transformed into hamburger by the sword stroke that should have ended the fight before it began. But the girl was safe, her would-be rapists dead or fled, and the other passengers slowly emerging from their terror to realize that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A moment when one man's courage had stood between civilization and chaos, and courage had won. In the eerie silence that followed the storm, Bishnu Shrestha stood swaying in the blood-soaked passenger car, his khukuri still gripped in his right hand, while his left arm hung like a broken wing at his side. The immediate threat had passed, but victory came wrapped in the bitter reality that heroism rarely unfolds according to Hollywood scripts. Despite his superhuman effort, despite 20 minutes of combat that would be talked about for generations, the bandits had not been completely vanquished. The surviving robbers, their nerves shattered by the unexpected resistance, but their greed still intact, continued their grisly work in the cars where Shrestha could no longer reach them. His devastating counterattack had saved the girl and eliminated nearly a third of their number, but mathematics and human limitations had finally caught up with the wounded warrior. As blood loss took its toll and shock began to set in, he slumped to the floor, watching helplessly as the remaining criminals finished looting the passengers who hadn't been in his immediate vicinity. The other passengers, traumatized by the violence they had witnessed, found themselves caught between gratitude and terror. They had seen what one man could accomplish when pushed beyond his breaking point, but they had also seen the price he paid for that courage. None dared to make eye contact with the fleeing bandits, their spirit for resistance thoroughly broken by the night's events. The stark lesson was written in blood across the carriage floor. Heroism doesn't guarantee victory, only that someone was willing to pay the cost of trying. When the train finally limped into the next station, it carried more than passengers. It carried a story that would challenge everything people thought they knew about courage under fire. The police who boarded the carriages found a scene that belonged more in an ancient epic than a modern crime report. 3 bandits lay dead, their blood mingling with that of the man who had killed them. 8 others had fled into the night, carrying wounds that would serve as permanent reminders of their encounter with Gurkha justice. The recovery of stolen goods told its own story of the night's chaos. From the captured bandits, authorities seized a modest haul, Rs 10,470 in cash, 33 mobile phones, 14 wristwatches, and an ATM card, along with the weapons of war, 2 pistols, live cartridges, and 7 daggers that had failed to save their owners from an ancient blade wielded by a master. But scattered throughout the train and the surrounding jungle, abandoned by fleeing criminals too terrified to carry their loot, lay a treasure trove that spoke to the scale of their ambitions. Around 400,000 Indian rupees in cash, 40 gold necklaces, 200 cell phones, 40 laptops, and countless other valuables dropped in their panicked flight from justice. The arrest of 6 bandits provided cold comfort to the passengers who had endured the night's terror. These were the unlucky ones, too slow to escape, too wounded to run, too shocked by their reversal of fortune to think clearly. They huddled in police custody, their confident arrogance replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of men who had looked into the face of death and barely escaped its embrace. Their capture would provide some measure of justice, but it could never undo the trauma they had inflicted or restore the sense of safety they had shattered. As paramedics worked to stanch the flow of blood from Shrestha's mangled hand, wrapping pressure bandages around wounds that should have been fatal, they marveled at the man's calm demeanor. Here was someone who had just fought the most lopsided battle in recent memory, who had carved his way through an army of armed criminals with nothing but an ancient weapon and unshakable resolve. And he showed more concern for the girl's minor neck wound than for his own devastating injuries. The contradiction would define how the world remembered this night. A hero who had accomplished the impossible while acknowledging the limits of what one man could do. Bishnu Shrestha had not saved everyone on that train. The bandits' systematic looting continued in cars he couldn't reach. Families still lost their life savings, and the psychological scars would last far longer than any physical wounds. But he had proven something far more important, that evil's victory is never inevitable, that ordinary people can become extraordinary when the moment demands it, and that sometimes the difference between civilization and chaos comes down to one person's willingness to draw steel and stand firm against the darkness, regardless of the odds or the personal cost. The sterile white walls of the hospital ward stood in stark contrast to the crimson chaos Bishnu Shrestha had left behind on the Maurya Express. For 2 months, this small room would become his world, a place where the immediate aftermath of heroism played out in the grinding routine of physical therapy, surgical procedures, and the slow, painful process of rebuilding a hand that had been reduced to hamburger by a bandit's blade. The doctors marveled at their patient's stoicism, watching him endure procedures that left grown men weeping without so much as a grimace crossing his weathered features. The injury itself was a testament to the savagery of the night's combat. The sword stroke that had nearly ended the fight before it truly began had severed every major artery and vein in his left hand, turning what should have been his non-dominant appendage into a useless collection of mangled flesh and bone. Lesser men would have collapsed from blood loss alone, but Shrestha had continued fighting for 20 minutes with the appendage hanging like a crimson banner, proof that some battles transcend the body's normal limitations when the stakes are high enough. Each day brought small victories measured in millimeters of movement, degrees of sensation returning to deadened nerves, the gradual restoration of function to fingers that had once wielded a khukuri with deadly precision. The physical therapists spoke in medical terminology about tendon repair and nerve regeneration, but Shrestha understood the deeper truth. He was learning to be human again, after a night when he had become something more elemental, more dangerous, more necessary than ordinary mortality typically allows. The girl whose honor he had defended became a regular visitor during his recovery, her parents accompanying her on weekly pilgrimages to thank the man who had transformed their worst nightmare into a testament to human courage. These visits revealed the true measure of Shrestha's character, not in the spectacular violence that had made headlines, but in the quiet dignity with which he accepted their gratitude. When her family attempted to press a substantial cash reward upon him, enough money to transform a retired soldier's modest prospects into genuine prosperity, his refusal was immediate and absolute. "Fighting the enemy in battle is my duty as a soldier," he told them, his voice carrying the simple conviction of a man stating an obvious truth. "Taking on the thugs on the train was my duty as a human being." The words would be quoted in newspapers across 2 nations, but in the hospital room where they were first spoken, they carried a weight that transcended publicity. Here was someone who understood that heroism isn't performed for applause or compensation. It emerges from an internal code that makes certain actions inevitable when circumstances demand them. The contrast between his own suffering and his concern for others became a defining characteristic of his recovery. While enduring daily agony as surgeons rebuilt his hand, one procedure at a time, Shrestha repeatedly asked about the other passengers, particularly the girl who had sustained a minor cut during the struggle. His relief upon learning that her wound had healed without complication was more pronounced than any satisfaction he showed regarding his own medical progress. For a man who had spent decades in service to others, the concept of personal sacrifice in defense of innocence wasn't heroic. It was simply the natural order of things. The slow return of function to his damaged hand became a metaphor for something larger, the gradual understanding that some experiences change a person irrevocably. The quiet mountain boy who had joined the Gurkhas decades earlier, the disciplined soldier who had served with distinction across multiple combat zones, the peaceful retiree who had boarded a train for what should have been an uneventful journey home. All of these versions of Bishnu Shrestha had been transformed by 20 minutes of combat into something new and unexpected, a living legend whose actions would be studied, celebrated, and retold for generations. As feelings slowly returned to his reconstructed fingers, and the doctors pronounced their cautious optimism about his eventual recovery, Shrestha faced a future he had never anticipated. The fame that was already beginning to build around his story, the transformation from anonymous veteran to national hero, the weight of expectations that comes with having demonstrated that extraordinary courage still exists in an ordinary world. All of this awaited him beyond the hospital walls. But for now, in the quiet hours of recovery, he could focus on the simple miracle of healing, the gradual restoration of the hand that had wielded justice when justice was desperately needed, and the satisfaction of knowing that when the moment of ultimate testing had arrived, he had not been found wanting. The irony of Bishnu Shrestha's situation would have amused him if it weren't so overwhelming. The man who had voluntarily retired from military service found himself ceremonially unretired for the express purpose of receiving honors that his own actions had made inevitable. The Indian Army, recognizing that some deeds transcend the normal boundaries of civilian versus military life, temporarily recalled him to active duty so they could properly acknowledge what he had accomplished on that blood-soaked train. It was a bureaucratic sleight of hand that spoke to a deeper truth. Some acts of courage belong not to individuals, but to the institutions that shaped them. The medals came with all the pomp and circumstance that the Indian military could muster. The Sena Medal, awarded for exceptional bravery in the line of duty, felt heavier in his hand than any weapon he had ever carried. The Uttam Jeevan Raksha Padak, recognizing his role in saving lives during a critical situation, transformed 20 minutes of desperate combat into official recognition of heroism that would outlast the man who performed it. But perhaps the most meaningful honor came from his former unit, a silver-plated khukuri that gleamed like captured starlight, a ceremonial version of the weapon that had carved his legend into history. The 50,000 rupees cash bonus that accompanied his promotion felt almost anticlimactic compared to the symbolic weight of the blade. Here was tangible proof that the Brotherhood of Warriors recognized one of their own who had upheld their highest traditions in the most unlikely of circumstances. The khukuri represented something more valuable than money. It was admission into the pantheon of Gurkha legends, a place alongside warriors whose deeds had been passed down through generations of soldiers who understood that some stories are too important to be forgotten. Yet fame, Shrestha discovered, was a more formidable enemy than any he had faced in combat. The media attention that followed his recovery transformed him from anonymous veteran to national sensation overnight, a metamorphosis that proved more difficult to navigate than any battlefield. Reporters appeared at his family home in Baidam with the persistence of besieging armies, armed with cameras and notebooks instead of weapons, but equally determined to extract their prizes. The quiet neighborhood where he had been hardly recognized suddenly found itself at the center of a publicity storm that threatened to upend decades of peaceful anonymity. The Indian media brought the incident to light, and the Nepalese media, too, gave it due importance, he acknowledged, recognizing both the blessing and the curse of modern celebrity. Without the girl's testimony and the journalist who amplified her story, he might well have faced criminal charges. A Gurkha found among dead bandits with a bloody khukuri in his hand could easily have been mistaken for a participant rather than a protector. The media attention that sometimes felt suffocating had quite literally saved him from imprisonment, transforming him from potential suspect to national hero through the power of eyewitness accounts and public sympathy. The strangest twist in his newfound fame came from an unexpected source. Bollywood music director, singer, and actor Himesh Reshammiya announced plans to create a biopic based on the Maurya Express incident. The prospect of his 20 minutes of desperate combat being transformed into cinematic entertainment struck Shrestha as surreal. The idea that his worst night would become someone else's dramatic interpretation seemed to encapsulate everything bewildering about celebrity culture. Hollywood had long since run out of original stories, but here was proof that real life could still produce narratives too extraordinary for fiction. The transformation from local resident to national figure brought unexpected complications. Mothers' groups sought him out as a speaker, schools invited him to address students about courage and duty, political leaders appeared at his door seeking photo opportunities that would associate them with his heroism. Each interaction required him to relive that night on the train, to transform private trauma into public inspiration, to become a symbol rather than simply a man who had done what he believed was right. Perhaps most challenging was the weight of expectations that accompanied his new status. People looked at him differently now, as if 20 minutes of extraordinary action had transformed him into something superhuman, rather than revealing the very human capacity for courage that exists within ordinary individuals when circumstances demand it. He had become proof that heroes weren't mythological figures, but real people who chose to act when action was required, a burden as heavy as any metal, as sharp as any blade. Standing in his family home, surrounded by the artifacts of his new fame, newspaper clippings, official citations, letters from strangers inspired by his story, Bishnu Shrestha faced a future he had never imagined. The peaceful retirement he had sought after decades of military service had been permanently altered by 20 minutes of combat that proved some battles choose their warriors rather than the other way around. The quiet mountain boy who had become a disciplined soldier had now evolved into something rarer and more complex. A living legend who understood that true heroism lies not in seeking glory, but in accepting the responsibility that comes with the capacity to make a difference when darkness threatens to overwhelm the light. Years have passed since that September night when the Maurya Express became the stage for one of the most lopsided battles in modern history. Yet the story of Bishnu Shrestha continues to ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. In military academies across India and Nepal, young cadets study the tactical implications of his 20-minute engagement. How superior positioning, intimate knowledge of one's weapon, and absolute moral clarity can overcome seemingly impossible odds. But the deeper lessons of that night transcend military strategy, reaching into the fundamental questions of what separates civilization from chaos. The tale has achieved something rare in our age of manufactured celebrities and synthetic heroes. It has become genuinely mythic while remaining undeniably true. Unlike the sanitized legends that populate our entertainment, Shrestha's story carries the raw authenticity of real blood, real terror, and real consequences. The girl he saved went on to complete her education, marry, and raise children who will grow up knowing that their mother's life was preserved by a stranger's courage. The bandits who survived carry scars that serve as permanent reminders that evil, no matter how confident or well-armed, can never be certain of victory when it encounters someone willing to pay any price to stop it. Perhaps most significantly, the story has transcended its cultural origins to become a universal parable about the potential that lies dormant within ordinary people. In a world increasingly dominated by cynicism about human nature, where daily headlines suggest that selfishness and cowardice have become the default human responses to crisis, Bishnu Shrestha's actions serve as stubborn proof that nobility of spirit hasn't vanished from the earth. It simply waits for the moment when circumstances strip away all pretense and reveal what someone is truly made of. The broader implications extend far beyond individual heroism into questions that societies must answer about themselves. What do we owe to strangers? When does the obligation to act override the instinct for self-preservation? How do we prepare our citizens not just for prosperity and comfort, but for those rare moments when moral courage becomes literally a matter of life and death? The Maurya Express incident suggests that these questions can't be answered through legislation or social programs. They require something deeper, a cultivation of character that begins in childhood and continues throughout life. In an era when warfare has become increasingly technological, when battles are fought with drones and cyber weapons rather than blade against blade, Shrestha's story reminds us that the oldest human conflicts between good and evil, courage and cowardice, civilization and barbarism, remain fundamentally unchanged. The tools may evolve, but the moral calculations that drive men to extraordinary action remain constant across centuries. The khukuri that carved justice from chaos that night was the same weapon design that Gurkha warriors had carried into battle for generations, proof that some truths about honor and duty are timeless. The most profound legacy of that September night may be its demonstration that heroism doesn't require special training, superhuman abilities, or ideal circumstances. Bishnu Shrestha was a tired veteran heading home to retirement when destiny placed him at the intersection of evil and innocence. He had no backup, no tactical support, no guarantee of survival, only his training, his weapon, and an unshakable conviction that some things are worth dying for. In choosing to act when action seemed impossible, he proved that the capacity for extraordinary courage exists within people who consider themselves perfectly ordinary. Years from now, when the specific details of the Maurya Express incident have faded into historical footnote, the essential truth it revealed will remain: that in a world where darkness seems ascendant and hope appears naive, there are still those who will draw steel and stand firm against the night. They may be outnumbered, outgunned, and operating without any reasonable expectation of success, but they will stand nonetheless, because they understand that the alternative is to live in a world where evil goes unchallenged and innocence goes undefended. The mountains of Nepal continue to produce warriors. The Gurkha regiments continue to serve with distinction across the globe. And somewhere tonight, another ordinary person faces a moment that will define not just their own character, but the nature of the world they choose to create through their actions. When that moment comes, and it will come, as surely as trains run through dark jungles and evil seeks to prey upon the innocent, the example of Bishnu Shrestha will serve as both inspiration and instruction, that one person, armed with nothing more than courage and an ancient blade, can still change everything